Well, as we begin this Resurrection Sunday here on Easter, I have a question for you. It's a simple question. The question is, what defines you? What makes you who you are? What are all those things that make you who you are? What are the things you're all about? And on some level, that can be a simple question, but obviously that can be a very, very complex question, because how do you even go about answering that kind of question? Where would you begin? I mean, especially in New York, right? Because this is a city that is constantly striving to define you. We're a city that's built on labels. I mean, you're even labeled just by how long you've actually lived in this city. You can be defined by your relationship status. You can be defined by the actual neighborhood that you live in. You can be defined here by your job, your career, and even further, like how successful are you within that given career? You're always as good as your next job, it seems to be. You're defined by the way you socialize, who you socialize with. But all those things, of course, are not who you are. We know that. Those are just outside observations. But we feel it. But honestly, if I wanted to really know who you are, there's so many guests here this morning, and if we were going to get to know each other, we'd probably sit down for some coffee, hopefully a cappuccino, because that's been my jam lately, maybe an Americano, but really into the cappuccinos lately. And I assume you'd start to just tell me some stories. You would tell me about moments in your life, key people in your life, seasons in your life, moments that left an indelible mark that had an impact on who you are. And then hearing about all those defining moments throughout the stories of your life, I'd begin to understand the why and the how behind all of them, and I'd better understand who you are. And of course, that's not only true of you and me over a cup of coffee, but that's also true about the one we've come to celebrate this morning. That's true about Jesus himself. We could ask the same question of Jesus. Who is Jesus? So, I mean, he's arguably the most famous person in all of history. There are over 2 billion people who, in some way, shape, or form, claim to follow Jesus. That's like a third of the world's population claims to follow this person of Jesus. He's represented in art and literature more than any other individual in all of history. Time magazine has called him the most influential person that has ever lived. But who is Jesus? Who is he? Well, like you and me, everyone has some form of an opinion on this. Whether it's just an off-the-cuff opinion, or whether it's an opinion that's really well thought out. Whatever it is, we think something when we think about God and when we think about Jesus. I have a short video here, kind of like man on the street style, that was put together by the people from Alpha, that's kind of asking that question in an off-the-cuff way about who is Jesus. And I'm going to go ahead and play that video right now.
Who is Jesus?
I think,
I believe he was a person.
he's the Son of God.
I don't believe Jesus ever really existed.
Son of God.
If I have to answer that question, I would say God.
He plays on the wing for Chelsea.
If you read the Bible, I don't think I believe in all of that.
Everything. He can be any, but for me, he's everything.
Who is Jesus? To be honest with you, I don't know. I'm not super religious or anything, so I mean, I guess he's a savior or something.
Personally, I think that Jesus was probably a really cool dude who lived a long time ago and gave great advice to people, and it snowballed from there.
Great. So that's part of Alpha, something I told you, we mentioned earlier in those announcements, been so life-giving in our church, which is basically this space where we have dinners together, and it's a series of open conversations, asking kind of these bigger questions in life around the Christian faith. But as we look at that, I think it should strike us that what we think about Jesus and what we actually think about what he came to do really matters in our lives. Because it shapes our heart. What we think about Jesus actually begins to shape our faith. And yet it's often something that I don't think we explore and dive into in depth ourselves. Whether we realize it or not, we're often just letting it happen to us. We're letting it be formed by our peers, by the media that we're taking in, by the culture around us. It begins to form this picture and image that we have of Jesus. And yet it's arguably probably the most important thing in our life. A.W. Tozer, he's a 20th century writer, and he states this. He says, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. That's quite a claim. The most important thing. So more important than your ethnicity. More important than your social identity or your sexual identity or your country of origin or the city that you call home or your education or your career. Yes, because it's that image that you carry of who Jesus is and what he's all about that shapes your soul. A great pastor from Portland named John Mark said this: often what we believe about God says more about us than what it says about God. Our theology is like a mirror to the soul. It shows us what's deep inside. So what's deep inside of your heart? Who is Jesus? And have you allowed yourself to explore and to see the true picture of Jesus and what he might be saying to you? Well, that's something we've essentially been exploring here as a church over the previous 6 weeks. We've been diving into this series called Defining Moments, where we've taken a look at key defining moments in Jesus' life and studied what do they say to us about him and who he is and what he came to do. I encourage you, if you are interested, to look at that podcast or that YouTube series and take a look at those defining moments in Jesus' life. The river and the wilderness, the story of him on a mountain and in the garden and on the tree. And this morning, on Easter Sunday, on Resurrection Sunday, I'd like for us all to have a chance to get a better glimpse of Jesus, and in particular, to look at his greatest defining moment, the most important and influential moment in his life and for all of his followers, the defining moment of the tomb, the day he rose from the grave. And today, as we've been reading this and I've been studying it through the week, I think one of the best ways we can understand as a church what Jesus is all about is by looking at the way he treated and interacted with certain individuals that he came across with on that first Easter Sunday and within that very first week when he rose again. And in doing this, I believe we will come to see that this defining moment for Jesus is a moment for all people. That wherever you find yourself this morning, whether you find yourself as a devoted follower or if you would consider yourself the furthest thing from that this moment actually has something to reveal to you specifically. So I want to just set ourselves in this moment of the tomb. Because see, on the onset of that very first Easter Sunday, it was not a day of celebration like today is. It wasn't a day of pastel colors and amazing brunches, though I'm all about a very good brunch. But on that day, over 2,000 years ago, the followers of Jesus were in mourning. They were disillusioned. They were distraught. Many of them were just wrecked with grief and filled with questions as they watched Jesus, their master, their rabbi, their teacher. He died just a few days ago. Do you ever wonder just what was going through their minds? I mean, what were they thinking as they witnessed the horrors of the crucifixion? I mean, most of them didn't have any kind of opportunity for closure at the end of it either. It's not like there was a big ceremony as the body was quickly placed in a tomb and the stone was rolled over and guards were placed on either side. It all kind of just quickly came to an end, just all of a sudden. It was violent, it was unjust, and everything they had once believed now was wrong. I mean, we can only guess what's going through their minds as they staggered away from that day, wandering back to their homes and their jobs. Feeling loss, feeling a lack of any kind of hope for something greater, experiencing shock, and not just loss of losing the person that they loved, but perhaps maybe feeling loss of a dream that they had. Loss of the vision for this preferred future that they thought was just around the corner. That Saturday and that Sunday morning must have been the darkest and most difficult times of their lives, filled with all these mixes of emotions, probably of anger, and some confusion, some numbness, some sorrow. I mean, I'd love just to be able to ask them, what were they thinking specifically during that time? Because I want to know, were they just sad and sorrowful, or were they also experiencing regret? Were they mad because they were feeling duped? Were they wondering why they left their families and their jobs to follow this guy? Why did they believe something so fully that turned out to be completely wrong? Were the past 3 years just for nothing? They were going through, I think, at the very least, that very first stage of grief that we all go through, which would be denial and shock. Some of them maybe jumped right away to stage 2 with pain and guilt. And look, if we're honest, we've all been in places like this before. For one reason or the other. Sometimes it is spiritual like it was for them. Sometimes it is just with the issues of life. We've had times of doubt. We've had times of confusion and struggling, moments of disillusionment and questioning. And if we're honest, we all come at these moments in our lives at different ways. We come about them in different ways. We react in different ways. And yet I believe we'll see through the Easter story that Jesus meets each one of us right where we are. He meets each one of us, and he offers us peace. So I want to read this account this morning. I think it's especially important to just read from the scriptures the whole of this Easter account. I want to read this morning from the Gospel of John. And as we do that, I want you to focus, in particular, as we're going through this, on the way that Jesus interacts with three different types of individuals. And I believe these three interactions, as we read, will represent the breadth of the spectrum of faith that many of us probably find ourselves in this morning. From those of us who are devoted, perhaps, like we see through Mary Magdalene, to those of us who are fearful, like many of the disciples, and to those of us who maybe find ourselves in a place of doubt and disillusionment, like Thomas. Let's read from the book of John. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one who Jesus loved. Don't you love that? John basically gives himself a cool nickname there. Good job, John. And then he said, hey, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've put him. So Peter and the other disciple, John again, started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter. I love that again, too. I love that he puts that in there. Like, hey, remember that time? For all of history, everybody will know that I was faster than you. He bent over and he looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him, because he was slow, and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying there in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. We get it. But in this moment, it says, he saw and believed. They still did not understand from the scriptures that Jesus had to rise from the dead. They're still processing. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And they asked her, woman, why are you crying? They have taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they have put him. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for? Thinking he was the gardener, she said, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him. And he says to Mary, she turned to him and cried, he says to her, Mary. He says her name. And then she turns toward him and cries out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. And he says, don't hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. And Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that she had said these things to her. Then on the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And with that, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. And then Jesus told him, because you have seen, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Quite a story. In this story, we see three types of individuals: the devoted, the fearful, and the disillusioned. The first person we see Jesus encountering is Mary Magdalene. And here she represents one who is devoted. I mean, she was up early. Did you catch that? She was up even before the sun was up that morning. Perhaps to mourn, perhaps to pray. But regardless, she was present. She wanted to be near Jesus, or at least near his body. She was checking on him. And we know Mary was also one who was faithful to the very end. She was one of the few that stayed there at the foot of the cross until Jesus breathed his last. And I find it interesting, but not an accident here, that one of the most devoted followers is also someone who is on the outside societally. As a woman in that culture, she did not have a voice of influence. She did not stand in a place of power. This actual account and testimony from her wouldn't have been even legally admissible in that time. And yet I believe Jesus is making a statement here. Jesus, he's so great. In his infinite wisdom, he never misses an opportunity to continue to grow all of us up in our faith. He never misses an opportunity to bring in restoration, and that's what he's doing here. He is bringing in restoration of brokenness here. Because through the resurrection, God is now doing something new. The cross now has changed everything. Because remember, at the beginning of creation in the Garden of Eden, sin took place. And because of that sin, there was brokenness. That perfect unity that we had as people with God in that moment was now broken. And because of that brokenness, it resulted in the curse. And that curse affected our relationship with God. That's why there's sin and shame and death in the world. That curse affected our relationship with creation. That's why we see horrible things taking place, troubles and pains in this life that we lead as we work and we toil. And it brought about brokenness with each other. We fight and we squabble. Men and women aren't treated equally. There's bigotry and there is racism. There are divisions between people in this world, not just small things like gossip, but big things like war. But as we read in that most famous verse that even if you're not a Christian, you've probably heard, John 3:16, for God so loved the world. He loved us. He so loved us so much that he didn't want this brokenness and this curse to be the final word. He didn't long for this brokenness to be there anymore. And so he sent his son Jesus to take the curse on himself. He died the death that we deserve on that cross. And when he rose to victory, he now can say, hey, that worldview, that reality of the curse will no longer be the final word in your life. The curse will no longer be the dominant narrative, but rather I'm here to establish a new covenant. That is part of this grand restoration movement of God. And we see it echoed throughout the entire Bible, in particular in the verse that we even root this church in, Isaiah 43:19, that says, for I'm about to do something new. See, I've already begun. Do you not see it? I will make a pathway through the wilderness. I will create rivers in the dry wasteland. See, Jesus established a new creation on this first Easter. And we no longer need to live under the penalty of sin, of that curse that happened in the garden. We get to live as free people. We get to live as free of the curse. We can live into the reality of how God actually made us to be in this world with love and peace and unity and creativity and purpose and justice. And that's why on this very first Easter Sunday, when Jesus rose from the grave and he comes to meet Mary, she mistakes him as the gardener. Remember it said thinking of him as the gardener? Seeing Jesus here as the gardener is imagery. It's like saying Jesus is now gardening in a new garden, like the Garden of Eden, but he is now coming and gardening afresh. What once was closed off now due to sin is now open again due to the redemption of Jesus. He revealed himself first to a woman, even though she didn't even fully believe at that time. And in so doing, he began to raise women up. And he gave them a greater voice and a greater dignity. And Jesus comes and restores dignity to the devoted. And he elevates the outsider. And then next, we are taken to the disciples. We're taking these disciples who are hiding in fear in a locked room. But notice this, he meets them in their fear. And he comes and he offers peace. Jesus does not chastise them. Do you notice that? He doesn't chastise them for being fearful. He doesn't come into that room and goad them for hiding in a locked room and calling them people of little faith. He doesn't guilt them for the fact that they all bailed on him during the crucifixion. Because like all those feelings of fear, that fear of chastisement, those guilting feelings and those shaming feelings, those are the things that we put on God societally. Those are the wrong views that we carry when we're thinking about God that lead us down this path of living a very different kind of faith. And for many of us, actually choosing to not have a faith at all. However, when we go to the source, when we allow ourselves to sit down with Jesus himself, we come to realize that maybe he's not exactly what we expected. Because you see, we see in the scriptures here that Jesus enters into their fear and their response is joy. They were overjoyed and they're introduced to the Spirit, to the Holy Spirit, and they're given vision. They are sent out and they're given a vision for the future. And then as we continue in the gospel account, just a paragraph later, we are taken even further, not just from the fearful, but to this infamous scene with Thomas. Thomas, who is the world's most famous skeptic. The guy who's actually known by most of us as Doubting Thomas. And we see Thomas as someone who's disillusioned. I think he's wounded. Perhaps he's even in denial. You see, Thomas was on the inside. He saw the great things that Jesus did. But he's been hurt. He's been damaged. I imagine on some level he's just protecting his heart here. But here we see Jesus reveal himself to Thomas in the midst of his doubt. And again, even to the doubter and even to the skeptic, the first words off his lips are, "Peace be with you." Which is interesting because peace is the opposite of doubt. Right? I mean, doubt happens when we experience something in our lives that doesn't line up with the way we see things or think things we're going to go in our minds. And because of that, everything just starts to become blurry. There's this nagging feeling of doubt that lingers inside of us that doesn't let us fully rest. And because of that, our doubts, I think, become our greatest barriers to experiencing peace in this world. Our doubts become our greatest barriers to accepting love. Our doubts don't let us fully give our heart away to God, much less to a friend or a partner. Our doubts won't let us fully engage in a loving community or into a church because those doubts linger in our minds and it stirs up these places of skepticism and cynicism on motives or authenticity. And you see, that wrestling that we have can lead us to a place of being half in and half out. So if we don't fully deal with that, we find ourselves in a place of spiritual stagnation. Or on the other side, we just go and do whatever we want. However, in Jesus' economy, doubt's not a barrier to love. It's an invitation. See, the most beautiful thing, I think, of all that we can grasp from this story is that Jesus has no problem with our doubts. His invitation to Thomas is, "Peace be with you. Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." His response to Thomas's doubt is an invitation to explore. He says to touch, to see, to understand Jesus' wounds for himself so that he may believe. What we see in this story of Easter is that Jesus came for all people. And that Jesus is far less concerned with our fear and our doubts than we are. So whether you're devoted, whether you're fearful, whether you're disillusioned, Jesus' response is the same. It's an open invitation to peace. And it's an invitation to explore. And look, I think we all have doubts. If we're really honest, we all have doubts and we all have questions. And I don't know what it is, but for whatever reason, we come into the church and we feel like we can't truly voice those doubts. But I just find that not to be very genuine. And we long to be a genuine people. And that need and that desire that we feel like we need to put that off is just something that's put on us by Christian subculture. That's not what we're seeing in the response of Jesus in the text. Jesus' invitation to explore is for all people. Christian or non-Christian, whether you classify yourself as religious or not, or spiritual or indifferent. Jesus came that all might have life. He came to tell a greater story. He has something to reveal to all people, regardless of where they are on the religious spectrum. See, throughout the Bible, you can see Jesus coming from this understanding that, hey, I get that we don't fully understand, you don't fully know who God is, but you can learn and you can grow. It's a process, and he invites you into that process of discovery. And that's what we want to be at Wellspring, a place where all are welcome to come and explore, a place where all are welcome to just step into that process of better understanding who Jesus is and then to work it out with friends and family as we try and live out the way of Jesus with one another. As we believe we are participating in what he is doing today and bringing peace and restoration into the world. And that's also why we've made it such a point and an emphasis to do something like Alpha, to cater in these meals and host these big dinner parties every Tuesday night, because we want to create an atmosphere, and we believe every church should have an atmosphere where honest questions and honest doubts and people's inquiries can be taken seriously. There needs to be a space in the church where people can be heard. So that's really what Alpha is. It takes place over a meal, which is good because food is always good. And I promise we always have great food and drink at Alpha. But the point I want to make is that Alpha's not centered on being right. It's centered on exploring. I have a short video here that I want to show of some folks who have gone through Alpha recently. And these are folks not, in London or somewhere across the world, although many across the world have gone through Alpha. These are folks right here in New York who've gone through Alpha.
I guess I considered myself agnostic, but other than that, did not really have any relationship with God before Alpha.
I was raised Jewish, and it was a long process in terms of conversion.
I was very angry at Christianity for, supporting war and colonialism and sexism and other things in history. So because of that, I was a little bit against Christianity.
My girlfriend, Alice, said, "Why don't you go to Alpha?"
I remember when I was telling people that I was going to go to Alpha, everyone goes, "Oh, there's free dinner, right?" And I was like, yeah, but is that why I'm going? But the free dinners did help.
What kept me coming back to Alpha, I think, was just the conversation. For me, that was just an absolute breath of fresh air.
I heard I could get to discuss my thoughts on spirituality, which was very appealing to me. I had lots of thoughts about spirituality.
It was real conversation. I hadn't experienced that where growing up, it was always you're being told about something and just follow directions and don't really have too many opinions on it. So it was refreshing to have an opportunity to talk with people that were coming from all different kinds of backgrounds.
It's really nice to be able to air your thoughts without feeling like you're being judged.
It's opened me to Christ and his teachings and feeling the love without any of the fear that I had felt before, without any of the anger that I had felt before.
We went on an Alpha retreat and I just felt really at peace, and it was a confusing feeling because in the moment it was whoa, what was that?
I had decided to read the Bible because of that experience, and then I had a similar really awestruck experience with God, and it was not in a moment where I felt like other people wanted me to feel that way. It was another moment where I was just at a train station by myself reading the Bible, and I was really struck by some of the words that I read, and I really felt like God was speaking to me in that moment.
I think if you're sitting here and you're on the fence about it, it's probably worth going.
Invite the person that you would least expect to enjoy it.
You have some trepidation about going to it. Open yourself to thinking outside of the box. Open yourself to the areas that have discomfort to you and see where it leads you.
Again, we are starting Alpha on April 10th, so not this Tuesday, but next Tuesday. You're all welcome to come. You're welcome to bring a friend. You're welcome to just invite a friend and have them come. We'd love to have all of you be there at Alpha. And that's because we believe that Christianity actually thrives under investigation. We believe Christianity thrives under honest investigation. Just like Jesus approaching Mary and Jesus approaching the disciples, he's got nothing to hide. And the same thing's now. He's not hiding anything now. I would just say, if you are doubting God, just keep digging. Because there'd be actually no scientific revolution. There would be no enlightenment if those that doubted did not keep digging. There'd be no universities that began because Christians were trying to discover the universe that God had put them in. Jesus offers all of us the opportunity to come and to touch, to see, and to explore. He said to Thomas, "Come, touch my hands and my feet. Examine the wounds. Place your hand at my side where I was pierced." Philip Yancey is a man who left the faith and then returned to the Christian faith. And he said, "I'm an advocate of doubt because that's why I became a Christian in the first place. I started doubting some of the crazy things my church taught me when I was growing up. This was the most unhealthy church, I must say. He goes, I'm also impressed the Bible includes so many examples of doubt. Evidently, God has more tolerance of doubt than most churches." So I would just say, if you are here today and you're carrying fear and you are wrestling with any kind of doubt, there is room here for your doubt. And I would say if you are here and you are exploring Jesus, there is room here for your exploration. And if you are here and you have legitimate baggage, or illegitimate baggage, I guess, if you have hurt and if you have pain, you are entering into a place of peace. And if you find yourself as one who is devoted, that you are seeking after Jesus, you are longing to be in his presence, then I believe more than anything that he is going to meet you in your seeking, and he is going to give you a voice, and he's going to give you a vision for a preferred future. There's this amazing artist. I have some of his work of art hanging in my living room, actually, gentlemen. I just placed it above the fireplace. And as amazing of an artist he is, he's actually a super kooky and weird guy. Very funny. His name's Charlie Mackesy. And we got to interact with him a little bit when we went to London on an Alpha trip once. And he tells this great story that I think is really helpful to explain the Christian experience today for many people. So Charlie, earlier when he finally became a Christian later in his life, he came to New York for a conference. And he had a friend there that was leading worship at the conference. Now, it was a Christian conference. And as he showed up, he asked Charlie, "Hey, do you mind actually helping me out with worship?" I think he also wanted to include Charlie in on that action and get a little bit of help. And Charlie's like, "Sure, I guess. I'm not very good, but if you need my help, I'll help you out." He goes, "Great. So can you just go out and find any kind of percussive instrument and bring it back?" And so Charlie goes out to find an instrument, and I don't know how this is possible, but apparently the only instrument he could find was a banana shaker. It's New York City, for crying out loud, and apparently the only instrument he could find was a banana shaker. I don't know if he was just busy or in a rush, but he comes back to the worship conference with his shaker to help with his friend leading worship. So his friend is leading worship, he's playing the guitar over there, and Charlie's just over on the side. Shaking the banana. Fast songs, slow songs, he's in it. Not just for an hour, he did this for 3 days at the conference. And so as he's packing up and they're getting ready to leave the conference, I have no idea how he's feeling in this moment. A woman approaches him and she's like, "Hey, can I grab you for just a moment? I just want to have a quick word with you." And he's like, "Yeah, okay, sure." And she goes, "I just want to thank you so much for your worship." And he's like, "Yeah, I try, And he goes, great, thanks. So he starts to pack up his stuff and he's getting ready to go in. And she goes, I just have one more thing I'd like to ask. He goes, "Sure." She goes, "Why were you on stage? Why were you on stage for 3 days shaking a banana?" Because you see, apparently, the banana shaker wasn't mic'd, so all this woman saw, or maybe all the hundreds of people saw, was this man on stage shaking a banana. And I just wonder sometimes maybe that this, at first glance, to the outside eye, is how Christianity may look and feel to many people on the outside. And you know what? Maybe it is true on some level, and that's okay. But I would encourage you that if you would go a little further, if you would allow yourself to dig a little deeper, to understand the deeper story, you would find that there is so much more. That you would explore and find peace and joy like you never imagined. So I'm not sure where you're coming from today on this Easter Sunday. It's a lifelong journey, this journey of faith. You may be like Mary Magdalene in a place of devotion, seeking after Jesus. And you may be fearful and hiding and unsure. Or you might be like Thomas in this place of disillusionment and doubt in your life. But what we see on this first Easter Sunday is that whoever you are and wherever you are invited to come and to explore. You're invited to place your hands on his hands. You're invited to touch his side and to ask him questions. You're invited to share your experience. See, Jesus approached his followers on that first Easter Sunday, and you know what he did? He put them at ease. He doesn't condemn them for their doubt. He doesn't shame them or chastise them for bailing or not knowing. He reveals himself to them. He lets them touch his wounds. He lets them explore at the very point of doubt and contention that they have, his resurrected body. You see, Jesus died while we were still sinners. So during the cross, the disciples were scattered everywhere. Jesus is on the cross, and others were disowning him. Some were just hiding. None of them fully believed or understood. And yet he chose to die. He still chose to take it all on himself. He wasn't requiring loyalty and faithfulness first. He was willing to risk it all for them, just like he's willing to risk it all for you, and he's risking it all for me so that we all can have that opportunity to explore and to find peace for ourselves. You're invited into the peace of Jesus, the one who's come to wipe away all pain and all sorrow and give us hope, to give us a fresh vision for the future. That's what Jesus is setting into motion on this first Easter Sunday. That's what Jesus is doing today on Easter Sunday. He is giving a vision for peace and a vision for hope. So let's pray as we celebrate Jesus.